Hello and welcome to Dialogue. A leading public health expert says the worst is over regarding the first wave of COVID infections in China. Meanwhile, the annual Spring Festival travel rush has just begun as people are starting to return home for the holidays. But many are wondering, could the mass migration usher in another COVID wave? Do we need to worry about the new XBB variant? And how do extra restrictions on Chinese travelers by some countries pose potential problems? To find out more, I'm glad to be joined by Fiona Edwards from the No Cold War Campaign International Committee, Dr. Jeremy Kim, Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, and Professor Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion. A leading public health expert, Liang Wannian, said Wednesday, for the overall situation, the first wave of infection is decreasing now in China. The number of severe cases is plateauing. It is fair to say we have weathered the worst of this round of infection. Baocheng, I will start with you. You are based in Beijing. You have witnessed, you have friends, you have discussed with people about the situation. Beijing is actually one of the cities first hit by this wave of infection. How do you describe the current situation in Beijing?
Well, the past 3 weeks have been rather difficult because the infection rate suddenly spread out after China has abandoned the control. However, this is really a necessary and wise decision because people need to really strike a balance between personal safety versus their economic and social activities. Actually, yesterday, I had a meeting in a coffee shop. Actually, life is back now. We do notice that those haunted restaurants and coffee shops and shopping malls, they're ushering more of the traffic. Not only because there is a Spring Festival that is coming to town. People now, after they have recovered from the first infection, they have more confidence to address their social and economic needs. So right now, people are putting behind some of the panic and worry, and they go for a normal life. And right now, the removal of those restrictions are really welcomed, and those complaints over a sudden lifting is almost disappearing.
Mm-hmm. And it's a time for the biggest holiday, of course, Chinese New Year, for people to have fun with their family and the family reunion. But then, internationally, Dr. Kim, people are talking about infections in China, or wave of infections in the future. We don't know yet. But we are seeing that, different provinces and cities in China reporting like 80 or 90% of infection of their population, for example. And at the same time, they say, they are passing, the peak of the infection has gone. And that's the end of the infection, at least for this round of infection. What do you make of that?
So it's very difficult for a person living outside of China to make any kind of accurate assessment of what's going on in China. What we see in the Western media are that infections are substantial, hospitals and emergency rooms are full, but that's not apparently what your experts are telling you within China. So it's very difficult for us to make an assessment based on data. Individually, we know that China has gotten rid of the standardized testing, the systematic testing that was being done during the period of zero COVID. And so you wonder how the number 80% of the population has been infected was derived. So again, speaking as a scientist, we need to know the methodology behind these different studies in order to get a better assessment of who's infected, who's vaccinated. China did the right thing in vaccinating as many people as possible. And it's the gaps in vaccination that have always been problematic when we look at the experience of other countries.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Kim, here, of course, there's a concern, with millions of people will be on the move. Actually, they already started for the Spring Festival travel, we say travel rush here in China. And then a lot of people will meet each other, from different parts of this country. But let's assume, for example, in Henan province, with the third largest population in this country, they say 90% of their population were infected, and then let's assume they achieved this herd immunity. Absolute majority of the population, if they have achieved the herd immunity, what are the chances of them getting reinfected in such a short period of time?
Yes, so I think unfortunately one of the things we've learned about COVID is that the idea that herd immunity protects a person against infection is not something that we've seen with vaccination or with previous infection. As you rightly point out, there's a period of time after you're infected that you appear to be relatively protected against reinfection. However, data from the US, from the Veterans Administration, suggests that some people within a very short period of time get one infection and then a second infection and even a third infection. And it's actually those unique reinfections that have the potential to generate something we call recombinants, where the virus normally mutates one sequence at a time. In this case, if a person has two virus types circulating in their body because of a reinfection, those virus types could recombine. And that's actually something that is a completely different type of mutation. So again, I think it's going to be really important as 2 billion people go out for the government to be able to track the numbers of people who may have gotten infected, because I think the experience in other countries, and particularly in big countries like China, where you have rural and urban populations that are relatively separated, that there could be not only one wave, but as one wave in the city is dying down and a new wave starts in the country, by the time that wave comes back, there could be an even bigger, there could be a second, a mini wave again. And I think that, for instance, if in Korea, where I happen to live, 20% of the Chinese who were coming into Korea and were being tested were positive. So if you imagine 2 billion trips during the 40-day Lunar New Year period, and 20% of those people are traveling infected, that's 400 million people, potentially exposing others, either during travel or after travel, to potential infection. So again, I think the government needs to monitor this, to continue to vaccinate as much as possible, and to understand whether new variants are being generated or what variants are present, because we know some of the new variants are much more capable of infection, even in the setting of previous infection.
The Chinese travelers, they started to enjoy domestically and also internationally as the country reopened. Fiona, we say there's, there are mixed, let's say, responses to the Chinese reopening. Some countries are warmly welcoming Chinese tourists. For example, in Thailand and in other countries like Indonesia, mostly Asian countries there, they welcome the Chinese tourists. It's important to their recovery of the tourist industry. But at the same time, we do see some countries are imposing extra restrictions, testing required for the Chinese travelers, like particularly in the US, for example. And then the Chinese side says, all such practice is not really based on science, it's about politics. What's your observation?
Well, I think the coronavirus pandemic continues to be a really serious threat to public health worldwide. And I think that what's needed is for humanity to come together and cooperate to tackle this. But unfortunately, what we're seeing from the United States, which is what we've seen actually for the past 3 years of the pandemic, is that they're trying to politicize the pandemic and use it as an opportunity to attack China. And as you said, this new discriminatory policy, which was introduced by Biden and a number of US allies, including Britain and other countries in Europe in particular, are also subscribing to this new rule, which is just to test travelers from China and not any other country. This is a very blatant attempt to try and demonize China and build up a narrative in the world that it's China that's the real threat in the pandemic. But the truth is that COVID-19 is extremely prevalent in the West. In England, where I live, there's over 30,000 cases in the past week, and over 800 people have sadly lost their lives. then in the United States, it's over 400,000 cases in the last week and thousands of deaths in the week. And there's been this claim that governments in the West are introducing this discriminatory policy against China because they're worried that variants might emerge in China. But there is actually already a very transmissible variant that has emerged and is circulating in the United States, which at the moment accounts for 28% of COVID cases. And there's no new measures being brought in the United States to deal with this in terms of public mandates to wear masks on public transport. And there's no restrictions on travellers from the United States to Britain or to Europe in terms of testing. So this is a selective measure to just target China. And I think it's about creating a narrative that China is a problem for the world and China is a health risk. And I think that it really comes down to sort of racism and xenophobia. And I'm very concerned that this will lead to a new wave of hate crimes in the West because people will associate coronavirus with Chinese people and have those sort of racist stereotypes will become even more prevalent.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, of course, that's happening at a time we are seeing also the geopolitical tensions, between China and the U.S. And in general, U.S.-led West. Of course, like in the new Congress of the U.S., they have the China Select Committee. Basically, they are talking about a new Cold War with China. Understandably, they would love to see, the Chinese image would go down. So as a Chinese, what's your response to the actual restrictions? Itself is not that big deal, specifically, but it's really about, whether it's, if you are singling out China or it's done against all the travelers from all the countries, it's a different story, right?
There are multiple interpretations over this issue. One is that, it is a retaliative measure because for the last 3 years, China has been introducing very tough measures over international travelers into China. And the requirement was even harsher than what is being imposed by these countries with China. The second interpretation is that, each country has different understanding and even different medical conditions to deal with such sort of spread. So therefore, to be precautionary over the sudden influx of Chinese travelers is understandable. And third is that it is discriminatory because you only address the Chinese travelers, and when the Omicron is generic all around the world. So that's something the groundless. And then I think now it is up to China. On the diplomatic circle, they need to do better communication with these countries on organizational level instead of individual travelers that are really there to complain and to shift their travel lines. And on the other hand, it is also the medical circle who is there to share more data and give more confidence with more transparency to those decision makers overseas. So therefore, for individuals, compliance is something that is necessary. But of course, they have their own discretion. If Japan and South Korea or United States are, creating further restrictions, and they can shift to Singapore, to Thailand, and those countries who are fully liberal for Chinese travelers. Mm-hmm. So I hope that this is really a temporary reaction, and through better coordination and better understanding, and it can be removed and coordinated around the world. And plus, that WHO, the World Health Organization, should be there to do a better job in coordinating on global basis for international tourists and international business travels.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Kim, if you look at the past 3 years, the knee-jerk reaction would be if there's a new variant, for example, countries would say, let's impose a flight suspension, stopping arrival of tourists from that particular country to protect the population. Understandable, but had there any been a successful case, by suspending flights or by restricting the arrival of the people, and then we can stop the arrival of the virus. And also in this particular case, there's a mixed response. For example, some countries are completely open to the Chinese travelers, others with restrictions. Let's suppose if there's a new variant, can we stop that at all?
So I think we see the answer to that not only in the case of China, but in the case of many countries that had fairly strict tracking and tracing and isolation of people as an attempt to control the coronavirus. Those efforts were very successful initially with the early variants of concern, but as we moved to Delta and then to Omicron, for instance, Korea recognized and said that at a certain level of infections per day, we are not going to be able to continue to do the things that we did. And so they did, as China did, plan extensively for how to manage the surge in infections to prevent hospitalizations and deaths, which is really what a country needs to do, protect its population. And then I think just to add on to what the other speakers have said, in the end, these quarantines and restrictions and other forms of somewhat or that appear to be punitive actually end up working against the economy of the countries that are doing this. So in the end, if there is comfort with the disclosure of numbers of infections and types of variants of concern and other things, then as the West did with, for instance, South Africa, which, as you rightly point out, was penalized for making the presence of variants known, which is just remarkable. We want countries to sequence viruses, to tell us what's there, and to punish them by then saying we're not going to allow flights is really, it works against science and public health and best practice public health. So again, this is something the world needs to deal with not only for COVID, but much more effectively for future pandemics as we think through the mistakes that we made during the past 3 years.
We need to learn, obviously, from the past 3 years. Dr. Kim, as Fiona pointed out in the US, this XBB 1.5 variant is quickly becoming the dominant variant in the US, basically leading to more infections on a daily basis. So how much do we know about this new variant? Of course, as China reopens, people, the public, to have concern, whether this new variant will be arriving in Beijing, in Shanghai, and how contagious is it?
So it's the most contagious of the Omicron variants that we've seen. It's a very interesting virus because it's actually a combination of two BA2 viruses. Remember I said that there could be opportunities for viruses to switch genetic information between each other, and this looks like it was created out of two different BA2 strains. It is very contagious, so I don't think it's a matter of if it will get to Beijing and Shanghai, but when it gets there. Because the flip side of opening up China and allowing tourists to exit China and go to, say, Thailand or other places around the world is that they will get infected with XBB. And if they're not detected, they will bring it back. And so you will see XBB 1.5 in China, and it will create probably another wave at some point, or maybe a variation of XBB 1.5 by then. But I think what we've learned about the coronaviruses is, and particularly the Omicron strains, it didn't work in Korea. Even China, with its zero COVID policy that was so effective for 3 years, just couldn't control the spread of this particular virus. Luckily, it isn't more severe than the other Omicron variants, so that if you're vaccinated and boosted and or have had previous infection, then you appear to have better protection against the most important things, which are severe infection, hospitalization, and death. And that's what countries are worried about.
Bo-Cheng, as Dr. Kim has said that obviously the work of the government, for example, in China, also is readjusting instead of preventing the infection among the public. It's really about the treatment of the disease, in particular for those vulnerable groups. For example, the one Chinese health official said, I quote, community-based healthcare staff are monitoring seniors for early signs of infection. Oxygen generators are gradually being installed in community clinics, and the doctors are working to distribute antiviral medication as soon as they are needed. So that's the right way to respond, probably, for the, let's say, second stage of response to the infection?
Well, I think finally we have surrendered. We wanted to create a miracle that China can really stand out to completely eliminate the COVID. And now we have to face the reality. The herd immunity is something that is now a necessary evil that we have to accept. And now we shift more from preventive measures into the active cure measures. And therefore, we do see that there is a mounting pressure over hospitals. Actually, my granddaughter is a nurse, and she's still coughing after, on the way for rehabilitation, but she has to go and work and take care more of the patients. And doctors and nurses are really facing the toughest danger, and they're really the hero and heroines of this country at the moment. And right now, for the Spring Festival rush, I think that's going to add further complications because, particularly when you see more of the people are, traveling from those cities to the rural areas where the medical care is, far more inadequate. So that can really add further burden onto the rural healthcare net. And then for China, the Chinese herbal medicine does really play a very important role, which is very unique in rehabilitation and in prevention. And then, the Chinese medical circle is also working very hard to produce new generations of vaccination, etc. And this will be a pacifying effect, as our previous guest Kim said, that it is unlikely that we're going to cut off any travel line of the new type of variants like XBB. Right. So that's why we still have to stay on alert.
Well, Dr. Kim, here's another controversial point, in terms of this pandemic here, about the vaccines, Chinese made vaccines following the traditional method, let's say, and then you have mRNA, mostly from the US and Germany, Western nations here. How different are they in terms of, say, prevention for the serious cases?
So that's actually a great question, and I wish I had a perfect answer for you. We have the individual phase 3 trials, which look to see whether the vaccines were preventing severe infection, hospitalization, and death, and whether the vaccines were safe. So the Chinese vaccines were between 50 and 70%. The mRNA vaccines were above 90%. Some of the other vaccines, again, were between 60 and 85%. What's more important are what we call effectiveness studies. Once we start taking the vaccines out of experimental trials and putting them into millions of people and looking to see whether protection against disease and death is actually really seen. And so there have been some studies, but not enough using the whole inactive, or not enough reported using the Chinese whole inactivated vaccines. Some of the best data we have say that the effectiveness is about 70%. The same study reported, and this was from Hong Kong, that the effectiveness of the mRNA vaccines was in the high 80s, so almost 90%. So there is a difference. What's the most important thing? It's that everyone be vaccinated and boosted if possible, that boost occur relatively close to the time when there are a lot of infections going on, because we know that for all those vaccines, immune responses decrease with time. Should there be what we call bivalent vaccine? Again, for instance, I've received my bivalent vaccine earlier this week, but But does it really do that much more than if I took another dose of the original set of vaccines, one of the protein vaccines like Novavax, or one of the adenovirus type vaccines from Johnson & Johnson? The most important thing is to be vaccinated and boosted.
And boosted. Of course, there are also studies say if with a booster or double booster, so the efficacy in terms of preventing serious cases, more or less, they are the same. But then there is a problem, Fiona. There are people and the media also, dismissing the Chinese vaccine completely. Any merit in this criticism, or is this part of like a conspiracy theory or politics at play?
Well, I mean, as has just been said, the vaccines have been shown to be effective, and it's China's vaccines have been an important tool to fight the virus, not just in China but internationally in terms of the billions of doses that have been sent around the world. And I mean, it really is the case in the Western media and Western governments that they will just attack China no matter what. So we've had blanket coverage in the last 3 years against China's zero COVID policy, which objectively saved millions of lives in China. I mean, if the US policy of just letting the virus rip from almost day one was allowed in China, then 4 million people would have died. And I think there's just a constant drip smear campaign against China, and that includes on the vaccines as well. But there's also a minority in the West which is engaged in spreading conspiracy theories against all of the vaccines, and that does get some sort of media coverage over here too. So I think, as has been said, the vital thing is that all these vaccines are an important tool to fight against the pandemic. And again, it's really disappointing to see the Western media try and politicize this rather than have a sense that this is a shared threat to humanity and we have to fight back together.
Mm-hmm. Well, earlier you mentioned about singling out the Chinese travelers could be lead to more racism or politicization of the pandemic. It reminds me of the very beginning, politicization of the pandemic. Remember, the Trump government basically called the virus, China virus. Of course, people are very much concerned about being singled out. So it seems like not only the Chinese tourists are concerned about the extra restrictions, but also groups inside the U.S., for example, Stop AAPI Hate, a U.S.-based national coalition addressing anti-Asian hate, said that, quote, targeting travelers from China is not just an ineffective policy, it also promotes racist and xenophobic attack against Asian Americans. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, they say in a war, the first casualty is the truth, which is true. But also in this Cold War, the second casualty has actually been people of Asian heritage in Western countries who have suffered greatly from all of this propaganda against China, including this racist propaganda from the likes of Donald Trump to say, the virus is a China virus. And this has very serious consequences, very violent consequences. So the group you mentioned, Stop AAPI Hate, they collect data on hate crimes. And between March 2020 and June 2021, there were over 9,000 incidents of anti-Asian harassment, shunning and physical assault within the United States. And we're seeing a similar trend in Britain too, where, basically when you have politicians attacking China and trying to suggest that they're a unique threat to humanity, which of course is ridiculous, this just encourages the far right and racists to attack people who appear to be Chinese or of Asian heritage. And that's just had very serious consequences. We've seen a really big increase in racism in the United States and in Britain.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.